I've for quite a while now wanted to make a stop motion film because it does almost seem obvious for someone with my interests. But I did know if I did decide to make a stop motion and I did it properly, then it was going to be a long project. Now, I can't quite then remember why I did decide to start this film sometime early last year, but that was when I do remember starting to come up with the ideas for the film. The specific inspiration, I'm not sure. I remember a rewatch of the Dark Knight trilogy and then also seeing Isle of Dogs for the first time. And I remember that I was going to have the extended holiday after my GCSEs had finished at school, and I thought quite naively that I was going to finish the film within that period, and that period was going to give me enough time to work on the project. Now, that was in fact very naive because it's now been 10 months since that point until the film was actually completed. So for this project, the script was really, really important, and it is for any stop motion because everything you do now is set in stone for the rest of the whole process, because there really is no improvisation on set or anything like that. So in this case, it was really important to do lots of brainstorming to decide on what characters I wanted to utilise. I always knew it was going to be a Batman film, but despite that, there are still a lot of decisions that had to be made. And in the end, I sort of decided I was going to make the film to try and answer the question as to why I like the character so much. He is my favourite character in all of pop culture, and I've never really been able to come up with a concise answer to why that is, so I thought that would be an interesting thing to try and tackle within the film. And as part of that, I also wanted to try and take a look at different questions that I've always considered with the character, like whether or not Batman actually improves Gotham, whether he succeeds on the vow that he makes, and how does Bruce Wayne think about that? How does he act upon that information? Now, I'm not going to sit here and explain the film, as that's not really the point of this video, but I will say that every choice that I made is as intentional as it possibly can be. For example, the choice of Two-Face as the villain is very purposeful for the story I'm trying to tell with Bruce within the film.
Harvey? Only half.
Once I'd essentially figured out the broad strokes of the story, I realised it was quite risky, as some may cry foul on Bruce ever making the decision to put down the cowl when it could lead to the potential doom of Gotham. And I really wanted to avoid the Last Jedi situation where you've got a character like Luke, who a lot of fans question whether he would ever become so passive, whether that character would ever be capable of that. But of course I did have one big advantage, as this is not set in any established universe, but I still wanted to make sure that that would not be the case, and therefore the time period that I set this in was going to be really important, and I therefore decided to set it pre-Robin. So this really is not a Batman who's fully established, not the one that we all know as this unchanging, eternal character, but in fact this story is almost part of the journey to the character reaching that point.
I will. And I always will.
One really important aspect when creating the storyboards was to remember that not to get too carried away, and what I mean by that is to make sure that all the shots were achievable, especially for someone like me who's not too experienced with animation. So I needed to make sure that every shot I decided on, every angle, every bit of animation that I was planning, I at least had a good idea of how I was going to accomplish it. The storyboards were also really helpful when it came to building the sets, as I often used the images that I drew on the storyboards as a guide for how the set was going to come together. I did also do extra concept art for the sets, but the storyboard images were always the first ones that I went back to look at because they allowed me to see what angles that I needed to achieve from each different set. While I was writing the script and drawing the storyboards, I was also casting for the film at the same time, as I really wanted to get all the casting done before I got to the edit, and for the most part that was successful. Now, before I even started the film, back way last year, early on, I had no idea how I was going to find the cast, and that was one of the main reasons I was sort of put off making a stop motion, as I wasn't sure who was going to voice it. But luckily, I ended up, after some research, discovered these two websites, the Casting Call Club and Behind the Voice Actors, which allow enthusiasts to put their projects on there and cast to aspiring voice actors, which is really, really helpful, and I would definitely recommend it to anybody who's looking for voices. As I say, I managed to find most of the voices for the film way before I started editing, which was really great, and I'm so happy with some of the performances that the actors gave.
Exactly, Wayne. You have no control over the fate of this man's life. So as far as I can see, you may as well tell me and be over with it, before you leave anyone else's life to chance.
My main interest in Lego has always been building the MOCs, and I knew if there's going to be one thing I could bring to a stop motion film, it was going to be the sets and the world in which the film takes place in. One of my favourite aspects of film in general has always been the practical effects and the large scale models. So I thought for this film one of my main priorities was to try and avoid using the blue and green screen as much as possible, and instead focus on building everything as practically as I possibly could, as I knew in the end it would turn out a lot better. So in the end I built 12 main sets for this film, which included the vertical Gotham MOC, the micro scale Gotham, Hugo Strange's office, Bruce Wayne's penthouse and penthouse gardens, Black Mask's weapon factory, Riddler's lair, the Iceberg Lounge, the back streets of Gotham, the corridor and the stairs leading up to the final scene, and then of course the rooftop which the final scene takes place on. There are also a number of little sets I built for the montage sequence, but these aren't really significant enough to deserve an individual mention, as you can barely see them in the film. Of course, each set that I built involved a different design process, with some having a lot more complexity, a lot more design sketches and planning. For instance, the vertical Gotham MOC, which I built in the update series on my YouTube channel, took a lot longer than something like Black Mask's weapon factory, for which I mainly just referred back to the storyboard when I was building that set. Yes, some of these sets do only appear for a few seconds within the film, and something like the opening shot, which includes the microscale Gotham, when you take into account both the time to build that model, which only appears in that shot, and then also all the compositing time, the filming time, probably took over 20 hours to complete. But for me, I really didn't want to include any pre-designed Lego kits, as for me, when I'm watching something like a stop motion or something like that, and I see those models, I don't see Gotham City or the world the film's trying to present, I just see the Palace Cinema or the detective's office. I wanted to try and light the film with as many lights built into the sets to try and increase the believability. And one great thing about shooting stop motion is because you're shooting stills, you have full control over the full range of the ISO, the aperture and the shutter speed of your camera. So you could even have maybe one or two tiny little LEDs within the set, and if you have a really long shutter speed you can light the whole set with that. Now of course that can become difficult with any minor alterations to the light within the room, as that will get picked up when you're shooting with such little light, and if the camera moves ever so slightly during when that shutter's open, that can cause challenges. But still, there's a little bit more variety as to how you can light the scenes when you're only shooting stills. For this film I'm using mainly those Light My Bricks light, which I've used on a number of different MOCs which I've built over the years, and then also the USB lights which I used recently on the vertical Gotham MOC. Now what that meant is, because I don't actually have that many lights, I couldn't have more than one set built at a time. So like I do with my MOCs, I dismantled each set and then sorted it back into all the drawers and then built the next one. As if I discovered a mistake later on in editing, I wouldn't be able to go back and reshoot it because the set would have been dismantled. I had to make sure I checked for any mistakes that I wasn't going to be able to fix in post before dismantling the set, and that I tried to get everything right first time around. For the first Wayne penthouse scene, I decided to have the scene look like it's backlit with the sunlight coming through the window and leaving everything facing the camera in shadow. Now of course I can't do this with real sunlight, as that would flicker too much and you'd see discrepancies between each frame with the light. So this was quite a difficult effect to achieve, but it was really important because not only is it quite aesthetically interesting, but also it's representative of Bruce Wayne's emotional state within that scene. So the effect was achieved using a cardboard box. Now with the cardboard box I cut a slit out the same shape of the window and size of that window, and then also 2 slits so I could put inside the large light bulbs which are used with the umbrella lamps that I use for most of my videos. Now except for that, the box was completely enclosed, and then inside there I stuck loads of paper onto all the walls so I could get that continuous white look. When I had the cardboard box right flush up against the window and I duct taped all the gaps within the cardboard box, the only light within the room, within the set, was coming through that slit in the cardboard box, allowing everything facing the camera to be in shadow and achieving the look that I was going for. This whole film involved a lot of learning, but the main area where I had to do the most learning was in the animation. As I've mentioned, I've dabbled in it before, but only really for fun and not to too much of an extent. So before starting, I tried to do as much research as I possibly could. Of course, there is a limit to how much you can do, because at some point you do just have to begin, and you could go on researching forever, but of course, like any of these things, the best way to learn is through doing. I knew when creating the storyboards though that it was really important with me to minimise the animation, only concentrate on the crucial movements to tell the story, and at least at the beginning not do anything extra that wasn't necessarily necessary. In fact, because the shooting of this film took place over such a long period of time, there are actually shots within the film where I think the animation is a lot better than in other shots. Some of the really early shots that I did, I actually cut out the movement by cutting elsewhere within the scene to hide the poor animation. To begin with, I actually shot everything using a live action reference, where I would shoot it in live action, change the frame rate to 12.5 frames per second, and then split it into images to use as a guide. In the end, I did discover that this wasn't really that helpful, as the movement of a minifigure is actually quite different to the movement of a human, and so the timing in animation is not really always the same as real life, but instead you do actually have to understand the medium and the frame rate you're shooting at, as in animation the movement can be quite stylised and the timing is different. But you can only really learn how to do that from experience, so still I can't really imagine myself not having that live action reference when I began shooting the film. Embarking on that first shot was a really daunting process, but by the end it definitely wasn't really necessary, and I did stop using any live action reference as I began to learn the amount that I needed to move the figure each frame and the process of easing in and out. On the production of films like Isle of Dogs or Wallace and Gromit, and a lot of stop motion you'll see on YouTube, the animators will use a software called Dragon Frame. Now what Dragon Frame allows the animator to do is toggle back and forth between frames and then also play back the shot as they're filming it, and that's really helpful to make sure you're not getting any mistakes while you're shooting the shot, but then also to really perfect the timing as you go along. So I wanted to look into whether I'd be able to get this software to help me shoot the film, but unfortunately my camera, the Panasonic G7, is not compatible with the software. So I ended up essentially shooting the film blind, or at least until I'd finished each shot. This was another reason why I actually wanted to use a live action reference when I first started shooting, just to give me some sense of what I was doing when I had no idea whatsoever. My camera does luckily actually have a stop motion mode which provides some very basic onion skinning, which did provide a bit of a guide and was helpful. But still, there were a number of situations where I'd reshoot the shot again and again to try and perfect the timing, or just to get rid of a mistake like when the set would shift or something similar to that. Like many brick films, I used clay to position the arms and legs in unusual positions, and I also used it to position the minifigures onto the set, because in this case I decided to not use too many studs just from a design perspective. I then also used mixel joints and wire to position minifigures or items off the ground, and then these were cut out in post and then replaced with a clean frame so they don't appear in the final film. I decided that before I start creating a timeline, I needed to go through and fix all the shots, because I thought that was probably going to be the most time effective way of doing it. I had a lot of shots to fix, mainly because of my inexperience, and which really did lead to so many mistakes. That was including the set moving, the timing being off, characters in the background moving that shouldn't have done, clay being visible, and lots of things like that. For example, the shot where Bruce and Alfred leave the main room in the penthouse included the set shifting twice. I tried to adjust the position of the shifted frames to match the previous ones, but with no success. So in the end, I went frame by frame, masking out Alfred and Bruce so that they could be placed back into the shot over a clean frame. I also did a similar technique for the shot where Bruce jumps off the GCPD, and that was because the set was moving in that shot also, where each shot I went in and I cut out Batman and then placed him back into a clean frame, as he should be the only thing moving in the whole shot. In the scene where Bruce and Alfred are in the penthouse, you could see the clay supporting Alfred on the smooth surface in the reflection of the window, and that was something that I didn't spot when I was shooting it, so I had to remove it in post, and there were lots of little weird fixes like that throughout when I was editing the film. One of the weirder fixes that I ended up doing was for Alfred's mouth. Now, this was something I didn't do until quite late on because I wasn't sure if it was going to be necessary and how I was going to do it, but the only Alfred minifigure I own has a smiling face, so that's what I had to end up using for the scene, and of course it wasn't quite the right face for the emotion that I was going for, and in the end what I had to do was alter the face in post using both Photoshop and After Effects depending on which shot the mouth needed fixing in. Although I wanted to shoot as much in this film as practically as possible, there are a few situations where I chose to use some form of compositing or visual effects. I have always loved the aesthetic of Batman stood atop a building with his cape flowing in the wind, and this is something I wanted to get into at least one shot within the film. I looked around on the web for a while at a custom-made cape for Batman, but I couldn't really find anything that I liked enough to use throughout the film. So what I ended up doing was shooting the scene which has a moving camera just with the normal Lego cape in a static position. I then removed the static cape from one frame and then edited this with the liquefy tool, which uses the real pixels but morphs them into a new shape. I then added the wave effect to this cape, which gave it a slight bit of movement, and then placed the cape back into the scene, tracked it so it stayed in the correct position throughout the whole of the shot, and then also made sure I masked Batman over the top of the cape. The opening shot of the film was shot at 50 FPS and then slowed down to 25 FPS, and it was shot on video, and this was to achieve the smooth dolly in towards the city. The shot was shot on a blue screen and from a number of different angles, as I was trying to figure out what would be the best perspective to provide the most believability to the scene. The keying of the blue screen unfortunately provided quite a lot of challenge because I shot the shot with quite dark lighting, which obviously works for the scene and the atmosphere, but unfortunately provided difficulty when the computer was trying to key out the background to replace it with the gradient which I'd created. So in the end I did have to mask out the background by hand, which luckily for this shot was not too difficult as the motion is quite easy to track from frame to frame. On the final shot I of course added in the background. I at first was going to go with something a little bit more stylised, but in the end decided the more simplistic gradient was going to be better. But I didn't initially have problems with the gradient having banding issues, which I really found difficult to fix at first, but in the end decided to add some grain to the background, which luckily managed to fix the issue. The final scene in the film featured the most compositing out of any scene in the entire film and did utilise a blue screen, which once more proved quite challenging and caused some problems when compositing this scene. I decided to use a blue screen for this scene instead of building a set because that would have been absolutely massive. Even if I'd built it at a smaller scale to try and create some forced perspective, it would have still needed to be extremely extensive to provide the depth which it would have needed. However, in hindsight, this may have even been a better option and could have potentially saved time, but I should have really printed out a printed backdrop and used that instead of a blue screen and compositing in post. I knew from an early stage that I was going to have difficulty with the blue coloured characters in this scene, so I purposely placed them nearest the camera so that I could really easily mask them out and place them in as a new layer, and that really did work well on the wide shots. However, on some of the other shots, I had to have different solutions to make this work. For example, on the shots with Mr. Freeze, I used a green screen. So there were purposeful solutions like that to try and make sure only one type of blue or green character were in the shot, so they could be keyed out but using the computer. However, there were some shots where I wanted both characters with green parts and blue parts to be in the same shots. Now, some of these shots I could mask out by hand pretty easily because those characters weren't moving, and then in some other shots, unfortunately, this was not the case, and that was mainly with the Joker. I thought the purple was going to be different enough from the blue for the key in After Effects to recognise the difference and not key out the Joker. However, this was not the case, and the Joker was keyed out in all those shots, so I had to go back in, mask the Joker by hand and place him back into the shots. Another challenge with this sequence in the film was the lighting. I decided to shoot the scene at a much brighter level than I had done with the opening scene, so that the computer could more easily pick out the blue of the background. This was more effective for the keying, however, it meant that the lighting of the scene is not correct for nighttime at all. I was able to partially fix this with a colour grade, but really I should have shot the scene with a printed backdrop, which would have allowed me in camera to get the correct light level. The background in this scene is comprised of a number of different photographs that I took of my microscale Gotham, which I built for the opening shot. Now, all these photographs were really darkly lit, and that was basically to allow me to hide the seams between each photograph in the final composite of the background. And I also, in this case, tried to shoot the buildings from angles they weren't seen in the opening shot, so that they didn't look like the same buildings that were in the microscale Gotham shot at the beginning. The first shot of the final sequence in the film was probably one of the most complex shots in the entire film, as it features a number of different things which had to be done in post. The background, of course, had to be composited in, and the mixel joints had to be masked out. But then there were also a number of fixes which had to be done, which really made the whole process a lot more complicated. For example, the whole set shifts between frames, and then also a number of the characters moves when they shouldn't do. This all led to an earlier rendition of the shot that was actually in the final edit of the film, which I ended up scrapping completely as I just wasn't happy with it, and then redoing all the fixes, redoing all the compositing, redoing all the masks to result in the shot you see in the final film. The other main visual effect that I had to carry out in the film was, of course, the mouth animation. This was carried out using the liquify tool in After Effects, which allows me to reshape the mouth and then use a slider to increase and decrease the distortion percentage, which I keyframe by hand throughout the scene. If the figures move within the shot, the distortion map can be moved to remain on the mouth. However, there are limitations to this, but overall, this process which I used did work well for 99% of the scenarios within the film. So once I had all the shots fixed and the effects complete minus the mouth animation, which I actually did right at the end, I started editing the film by following the storyboards. Now, it wasn't quite as simple as following instructions, as some creative decisions did still have to be made. For example, the dock scene actually was originally right at the start of the film, before the Hugo Strange office sequence, but I decided, despite it does serving some narrative purpose of establishing Batman's character a little bit and also some more atmosphere, it wasn't really best placed before the Hugo Strange office scene, as it sort of prevented the story from properly getting going. So in the end, I decided to place it within the montage sequence, as within the sequence it serves the same purpose as all the other shots do, but also it helps that sequence as it adds a little bit of pacing and timing to it. Because the animation in this film is cut right down to the most important movements, finding the right music was really important to help me portray the correct emotions in each sequence. Now, finding copyright and royalty-free music can always be a massive challenge on the internet, because you not only find something that fits the right style of all the other pieces within the film, but you're also looking for something which has the right tempo, the right tone, the right duration, and something that's not instantly recognisable that gets used in every other YouTube video. I started looking for music when I started writing the script last June, but in the end I am really happy with what I was able to find. Most of the time, they're not a perfect fit with what I had in mind with the storyboard, so modifications to the sequences did have to be made. For instance, this Two-Face part in the bar scene was added so that it fit the music better.
Why are you here?
But not only do you have to look for the music for each scene, there's also, of course, the sound effects. They also take a long time to look for and source, but I also did record some of my own for ones that I couldn't find. For example, the sound of the coin spinning on the table was one that I recorded myself. So that does bring this video to an end. I've tried to cover all the main aspects of production in this video, but if you do still have any questions, feel free to leave them in the comments and I'll answer them as soon as possible. Now, in terms of what I've got planning next, of course I've got the mock showcase for the Vertical Gotham mock, and that's what I'll start working on in the immediate future. I'm not going to make any promises as to when, but just bear in mind that is what the next video on the channel will be. And that video will of course go into all the little details of that mock, all the rooms, which I know quite a lot of people are asking for on the last update video. In terms of another stop motion, I'm not planning anything at the moment, but it's certainly not something to rule out in the future. It's just I want to work on some other projects and then maybe come back to it once I've got some new inspiration for a new idea. But of course that does bring this video to an end. I really do hope you did enjoy both this video and of course the stop motion, because that's been a huge project which I've spent loads of time on, and I'm really happy with how it came together in the end. There are of course some things which I'd like to change about it, but it's something that overall I'm really happy with. But most of all, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you stick around for future content.